Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's going on in the UK economy. And if you're interested in the UK economy, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, because the UK is probably the worst performing economy that I'm talking about. I'm from the UK and I know a lot of people watch from the UK, but unfortunately, not a lot of people watch the videos about the UK. So if you want me to make more of them, please hit that like button and subscribe. Anyway, I want to talk to you about the latest jobs data that has been released, which is actually a lot more negative than the markets were expecting. And this is now likely to lead to an interest rate cut in March. Originally, it was expected that the interest rate cut would take place in April, but I think that's going to be brought forward because things are really starting to slow down in the UK at a much more rapid pace than expected. And in order to boost the growth, we need to cut interest rates. And I think inflation is now at or around where the Bank of England expects it to be. And what we're seeing is that the slowdown in the economy is actually becoming more important than managing inflation, because if GDP continues to contract or actually doesn't grow at the rate that the Bank of England needs it to, then the economy is heading towards some form of recession in 2026, and nobody wants that. So, if we have a look firstly at the unemployment data that's just been released, it's come in at 5.2%. And this chart, which goes back over the past 5 years, shows that that is now the highest level that we've seen since the COVID pandemic, since February 2021. And if we look at what's been happening over the past 18 months, since Labour actually won the general election, you can see that there has been a consistent increase in unemployment. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show the last 10 years, if we exclude the COVID 19 pandemic, which was obviously an exceptional period when the whole world closed down, so clearly unemployment was going to be at a high rate at that time because anybody that was in a job where they could be laid off, then they were laid off. You can see that the current rate of 5.2% is actually the highest that we've seen in 10 years. So this really puts into perspective just how serious the situation is. And I think the steepness of the curve on the right hand side here in 2025 is cause for concern, because this is now accelerating at an increasing rate. And one of the things I think that's really concerning right now is youth unemployment. So this is basically people between 18 and 24 years of age. So entering the workforce for the first time, either they've just left school or just left university, and they're looking to get their foot onto the career ladder to build their future career. And you can see that the unemployment rate amongst the youth is now up to 14%. And if you look at over the last few months, there's been a rapid acceleration in that rate. And 14% is actually the highest that we've seen in 11 years in the UK. So this is really cause for concern. If we widen the scale of this chart to show the last 10 years, if we exclude the COVID pandemic, which obviously was exceptional, you can see that before that period, youth unemployment was coming down to around about 10.5%. So 14% is exceptionally high. If we have a look at this chart, which actually includes a metric looking at unemployment between 16 and 24-year-olds, it's shown by the yellow line. You can see that it's sitting above 16%. So unemployment for 16 to 24 does track at a higher rate than 18 to 24-year-olds, because it's harder to get a job if you're 16 or 17, because you're pretty much expected to still be in some form of education, whether that be formal education or learning a skill or an apprenticeship, something like that. This is really quite concerning that young people can't get jobs. They're not starting out their careers. And that's obviously going to be bad news over the longer term, because if unemployment does start to come down generally, then these people need to get a job to get started. So this is one of the reasons why I think the Bank of England needs to kickstart what's happening in the economy. And if we have a look at this metric, which shows the number of job vacancies compared to unemployed people, you can see that it's now sitting at 2.6. So there are 2.6 people per every vacancy that's currently being advertised. And that's the highest that we've seen since the COVID pandemic. You can see there's been a consistent upturn since 2023. And if we exclude the pandemic, it's actually the highest that we've seen since 2014. So 12 years. So all of these indicators tell us that there are serious problems. It's not just a short term blip. This is a longer term trend that is now starting to develop. If we have a look at the wage data that's just been released, it shows that year on year, wages are up by 4.2%, which you might think sounds quite good. But when you look at the trend over the past 12 months, you can see that wage increases are trending downwards. And if we look at this chart, which breaks out the difference between public sector and private sector wages, it shows a really interesting trend. So the yellow line here is the average wage increase. So you can see that that's come in at 4.2% for the latest data. The thicker grey line, which is going upwards, shows the public sector increase. And you can see that that's come in at 7.2%. So that is really quite a high level. So government employed people or people employed by the state are seeing large wage increases at the moment, but private sector wages have only increased by 3.4%. So that's less than half of the increase from the public sector. So interestingly, if you're working in the public sector, you're doing better relatively than the private sector right now. And that is concerning because obviously the public sector is funded by the state, whereas the private sector is funded by private companies. So private sector pay is rising at a much lower rate, and that means that wage increases across the board here are being subsidized by the public sector increases. So once again, this is another warning sign that I think the Bank of England will take heed of and definitely will reduce interest rates in April unless we see some very surprising data coming out with regards to inflation, which I don't think is going to happen. So what does all of this mean? What does this indicate for the UK economy? Well, GDP is already struggling at the moment. If we have a look at this chart, which shows GDP month on month movements over the past 12 months, you can see that in 6 out of the past 11 months, we have seen a reduction in the month on month change in GDP. And GDP growth in December was only 0.1%. So we're seeing a real slowdown in the economic growth. And obviously, GDP is partly funded by taxes, and taxes come from wages. So people in employment and wage levels are obviously critical in terms of keeping GDP growth going. So this is an early warning indicator that GDP is likely to be impacted as unemployment rises, employment goes down. And if we look at what's been happening with interest rates, we can see that there have been 6 consecutive interest rate reductions since the summer of 2024. Rates have come down from 5.25% to 3.75%. So it's likely that they will go down to 3.5% in March. And the reason why the Bank of England does that is because it helps encourage both companies and individuals to take on debt because it's cheaper, and also it lightens the load for people who've got existing debt on floating rates. A lot of mortgages in the UK don't have long-term fixed rates. They might only have a fixed rate for 2 years or 5 years. A lot of those rates have matured recently, and because rates have been high, the renewal rate to go to a new fixed rate is prohibitively high. So a lot of people are sitting on floating rate mortgages at the moment. This is the biggest single form of debt in the UK. So reducing the interest rate will alleviate the interest burden for a lot of those people and also encourage people to take on new debt. And obviously, when you take on a new loan, then you have to spend that money on something that increases spending and therefore drives up demand and hopefully boosts growth in the economy. So the overall summary of today's video is that the data that has just been published in terms of unemployment, employment opportunities, and wages is all lower than expected. These results are worse than everybody was anticipating. Unemployment is now at the highest level, excluding the pandemic, for the last 10 years. Youth unemployment is becoming a significant problem. Wage growth is slowing down rapidly, and all of this is pointing to a cut in interest rates in March by the Bank of England, which I think is going to be the first of potentially 3 cuts in 2026. I think we could see interest rates down at 3% by the end of this year if things continue as they are, because The Bank of England needs to make it cheaper for both existing and new borrowers to encourage people to take on more debt, to spend in the economy and try to boost growth. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. Then if you have, please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. It's another way of funding the channel, so if you're interested in getting involved, please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Thank you to everyone that's supporting me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.